Just a few weeks ago, on Gold Star Mother's Day, our guest quoted Herman Melville, stating, "We cannot live only for ourselves." What better definition of what it means to be a leader, someone whose purpose is to serve others? Hi, everyone. I'm Jim Falk, President of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. General Martin Dempsey, who serves as the 18th Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, is the author of No Time for Spectators, the lessons that mattered most from West Point to the West Wing. His book takes us behind the closed doors of the Situation Room, onto the battlefields of Iraq, and to the East German border at the height of the Cold War. General Dempsey will be in conversation with my good friend, a former board member of the World Affairs Council, retired Colonel John Ward. I'd like to remind you that you can purchase a copy of No Time for Spectators by going to interabangbooks.com. And as our members and frequent viewers know, all you have to do is write in the code dfwworld to get a 10% discount, not just on No Time for Spectators, but for any books that are in your shopping cart. I want to thank our sponsors and partners. Thank you, Ann and Charles Eisman. Additional thanks to the NDIA Lone Star for their promotional support, as well as World Affairs Councils from across the country, especially Jacksonville, New Hampshire, and New Orleans. And to learn about a World Affairs Council in your community, just go to worldaffairscouncils.org. You can always keep up with all of our past programs by going to DFW World. Just go to YouTube. Our channel is DFW World. So let me tell you a little bit about John Ward. John had a distinguished 28 career of military service before he joined Lockheed Martin in 1997. At his retirement in 2014, he was Vice President of Domestic Business Development at the company's headquarters. He's a graduate of the U.S. Army War College and the National Defense University. But what he'll tell you first is that he received his bachelor's degree from Auburn University. He also has an MBA from Boston University. As I mentioned, John is a good friend of mine. In fact, he is right here in my little studio here at home. So I'm going to get up and John will take my chair, and I look forward to listening to the conversation. Thanks again for being with us.
Thanks, Jim. We should have practiced that handover a little better, but I think it came out all right. So again, welcome General Dempsey virtually to Dallas-Fort Worth. I'm going to go through an introduction, and of course, on the jacket of the book is the complete bio of the good general. But he became the 18th chairman in 2011, serving 2 terms from 11 to 15 under President Obama. Past assignments have taken him across the globe in peace and war. From platoon leader to combatant commander. He's a 74 grad of the USMA and a career armor officer. He served in the 2nd Cavalry in United States Army Europe, and also served as an instructor of English at West Point, which I want to delve into a little bit as we get into this. He deployed in 1991 with the 3rd Armored Division to Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm, and was the 67th Colonel of the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment, one of the Army's premier cavalry units. As a general officer, he served as Deputy Director J5, Assistant to the Chairman, and notably served in the PM Saudi Arabian National Guard, which gives pretty good insight into a lot of the things that are very important to the Saudis and, of course, to the Middle East. Importantly, he took command of the 1st Armored Division in Baghdad. After 14 months in Baghdad with the 1st Tank, he returned to Iraq for 2 more years as a trainer, and from 7 to 8, he served as deputy commander, then acting commander of U.S. CENTCOM. I almost hate to say this, he was there's a glitch in the law, but he had to serve as a service chief before he could come and serve, because I think you had to be qualified as there's a little niche there. So he served for 4 months as the chief of staff of the Army, and then was nominated and became the 18th chairman. Distinguished awards, and is of course married to his high school sweetheart Deanie. They have 3 kids: Chris, Megan, and Caitlin. So again, welcome to Dallas-Fort Worth, virtually.
Thanks, John.
Yeah, good to see you. First off, I think one of the themes that I really resonated with is your thought about living a felt life. And I think that has a lot, the whole thing about no time for spectators, being involved, being in the here and now. Could you elaborate on that for our audience? I think we really glommed on that notion.
I'm glad, actually. And, you know, I'm sure many of those in the audience probably have written their own books or, you know, began the effort to write their own book. And one of the things that happens pretty quickly once you have an editor and a publisher is they want to influence the title maybe more than anything else. And that idea of living a felt life, I really wanted to get that into the title, and they really didn't want me to get it into the title because they said, what does it mean? And I said, well, read the book. Maybe you'll actually figure it out. But they said, it's a little bit abstract and somebody might think it's the texture felt. And I said, okay, I got it. So I backed up, but I do think it permeates the book in the sense that what I wanted to do was use my life's experience and the vignettes in there, and actually they're not all my own personal vignettes, as you know, but to reflect on them. I mean, at some level, this is as much a reflection of what I found to be important over time in relationships among leaders and followers, because any endeavor that succeeds, it's because leaders and followers have aligned themselves behind a common vision. And you can only do that if you, in my judgment, whether you're a leader or a follower, is if you allow yourself to be, as you described it, in the moment, with a sense of belonging and feeling what's going on around you, not just observing it. And so, the book describes how I learned that phrase, which was from the head of the English department at West Point when I was a freshman cadet. And it probably took me a decade or more to figure out what he was talking about, but it made a lot of sense then, and it maybe makes more sense now.
Yeah, it's excellent. And I really wanted to talk about one of the wonderful things about the United States Army, and I don't want to go into that, but they give you a chance to do different things at different levels. And I think you really enjoyed your time as an instructor at West Point in English. And these kinds of assignments give you a chance, in my opinion, to back away from the target and look at the big picture, see where we're going, and kind of think about it. What are your thoughts about that?
Absolutely. And one of the other themes, besides the kind of the encouragement to live a felt life, was to realize that there are times in your life when other people might know what's best for you than you do. Although we all have an ego about what we think is best for ourselves, but at many different stops along the way, my mother convinced me to go to West Point. The Secretary of Defense convinced me I should be the chairman, against my protestation on both ends of that spectrum. But in the middle, I was at a point in my career where I had time to do some kind of, let's call it, developmental assignment. There were those who persuaded me that I should go to West Point, and there was quite a few that tried to talk me out of it, because the idea was you're going to get yourself out of the mainstream and your career will pass you by. But one of the best things that ever happened was I listened to those convincing me to go to West Point, and then I chose the English department for two reasons. One, kind of survival. I thought I could get through graduate school and get a master's in English far more likely than in physics or something. Unlike some of my classmates who were part of your group, like Ralph Graves, who could have gone back to teach anything, but I went back to teach something I thought I could know something about. But to my great surprise and long-term benefit, the English degree and the discipline to achieve it and the living vicariously through literature, for example, helped me a great deal in every job I had thereafter.
Yeah. Well, as you go through the Army, even and you transition upwards, and it seems like you might be a commander and leader, but at the other hand, you also have to be a follower. And I think you bring out pretty clearly importance of I'll say followership. And I think you begin to learn the rudiments of that in your West Point and basic courses, but kind of illuminate, if you will, a little bit of the idea of followership for our listeners, because it's crucial to me. I've had good leaders and and I've had good followers, and I've had some not so good followers, and
Sure.
that eats up a whole lot of your time.
It
Yeah.
does. And in terms of time, when you look at the body of work throughout an entire lifetime, you're going to be a follower more often
True.
than you're a leader. And yet we spend a whole bunch of time trying to illuminate what it means to be a good leader. And we spend a little, I think, less time illuminating what it means to be a good follower. And
Mhm.
so what I decided to do was pick attributes where, in the absence of common expectations, we would
Right.
fail to be the organization we think we need to be. Character, loyalty. Loyalty was a really interesting one to me because
Absolutely.
it's one of those where you could be persuaded, and some might argue that you owe loyalty is something that you're owed up a great deal and down only a little bit. And frankly, in the best organizations that I've been part of, and the best organizations I've seen as I've now gone through my post-military career, when there's a real sense of loyalty in both directions, the organization just produces far better outcomes.
Yeah.
In any case, again, back to the editor and the publisher, they said, we got to, this is a book about followership. I said, no, it's really not. It may feel like that because you're a follower more than you're a leader. But I said, it can't be about one or the other. I've got to find a way to get both of them, both aspects of this relationship into the book. And then the one thing the publisher said was, okay, but don't even come to me with a suggestion to call this book about followership, because he said, nobody in their right mind is going to pick that book up.
That's excellent. One of the things you also talk about is always sweating the small stuff. And it strikes me that as a senior commander, for example, 1st Armored Division, CENTCOM, the details are very important, but can you get too involved in the details? I mean, knowing them and having the discipline yourself to not go down and sort of, check the squad leader's backpack and things like that. But it's important to know what he needs to do.
Sure, that's almost two different things, though. When I talk about meaning sweating the small stuff yourself in what your expertise requires is always a good idea. Sweating someone else's small stuff, which is normally called micromanagement, is almost always not a good idea.
Right.
And there's an important distinction there. But what I when I talk about this in my classroom at Duke University, or if I'm I do a little work with the MBA, and I'm the chairman of USA Basketball. And one of the things that's just completely struck me, and what got me to think about making that a chapter in the book, was watching some of these elite, I mean, really elite athletes like Kobe Bryant, watching them prepare. And Kobe Bryant, and this is a story that's probably pretty well known, but he would, if he knew he had to work out at 9 o'clock, he'd go at 8 or 7, and with a personal trainer, and he would work for an hour on footwork, how to come off a screen and maintain your balance, or how to cut without the ball along the baseline. And it was just fascinating to watch. And obviously, if you haven't heard the story, he was right. Somebody was following him at kind of a day in the life of Kobe Bryant, and watched him do this, and said, "Why in the world, Kobe, would you, do you come to the gym an hour ahead of practice in order to work on your footwork? You're the best player in the world." And he said, "Well, how do you think I got to be the best player in the world?" And that's really true. I have to tell you, using the example of sweat the small stuff. When I got to the Pentagon, I had been the commander of training and doctrine command,
right.
So I knew a lot about the institution and how the institution ran, to include a lot about the budget. Then I became the chief, and I was at we call it charm school. You may know that, right, where we take all the brand newly selected brigadier generals, and we take them out to Fort Leavenworth, or we did for about a week or so. And we called it charm school, though, that was just a joke. It was, to kind of ground them on how to make the transition from being a colonel to being a general. And I was struck by how little most of them knew about how the institution ran, and importantly, how the budget the federal budget runs.
Right.
And I'm telling you, if you don't know how the budget runs and the milestones that you have to hit in order to get your requirements met, you're going to get left in the dust. And so that's one of those fundamentals, that we established along the way. But again, you have to know the fundamentals in your job. You have, if you've passed through it, you clearly will know the fundamentals you've left behind.
Right.
But again, you have to be careful not to be a micromanager.
Well, yeah, but really, you do have to understand in depth what's going on in your organization. Another thought is that came out in the book is sensible skepticism, and I think Mark Hertling is mentioned in there somewhere, and that role. And I knew him as a major, and he was sensibly skeptical as a major as well. And a little bit of a rebel. He was in the Black Hawk Squadron. But anyway, talk about that idea, because you do, if you're skeptical, you don't want to be perceived as being, I'll say, disloyal or not on the team or what have you, but you really do need to look at everything. Yeah, go ahead.
No, and that's the point. There's another chapter about being inquisitive and questioning and a lifelong learner. The reason I chose the phrase sensibly skeptical, and I'm sure now, based on the fact that I have an English degree, you'll have recognized the alliteration of those two chapters, sensibly skeptical and responsibly rebellious, is that, you'll hear a lot of people say, I don't know what to believe anymore, and it's kind of akin, you remember, I'm guessing you'll remember that John Adams, before he became president, famously said that in trying a case, actually, related to the Boston Massacre, he said, facts are stubborn things. I'm not so sure they're all that stubborn anymore. And the more facts become less stubborn, the more that information can be, well, it is ubiquitous, the more that it can be contradictory, I think the more skeptical we have to become. And skepticism is not cynicism. I think skepticism is, just being a little wary that you don't carte blanche accept something until you use your own knowledge, your own education, your own inquisitiveness, and your own experiences to validate it. And that's the examples I gave in the book. Famously, people say, how is it possible that, we can't figure out exactly what's going on in Afghanistan? Well, I can tell you, it's hard to figure out what's going in a place like Afghanistan. And I remember getting assessments, some from the commanders on the ground. I'd get an assessment from them. I'd get an assessment from the intelligence agency. The State Department would provide an assessment on the state of the growth of governance or lack of in Afghanistan. And we were supposed to all, meld those into something that made sense for the president so he could make a decision. And so that's where I began to think about this idea that skepticism is not a pejorative term, because, generally speaking, the military assessment was a little too positive, frankly. And the intelligence estimate, because they only get an A or an F, in case you haven't noticed, their assessment was generally really pessimistic. And what we wanted to bring to the president was something that was a little more pragmatic. And so we had to be a little skeptical of both.
Yeah, well, I thought that was a great vignette, and I want to kind of depart a little bit from leadership, and I want it, and at the end we can wrap up. But I wanted to get into some of the vignettes, because as the chairman for 4 years, I mean, I think you came in after the War College, as did I, with kind of a broad notion of what national security consists of, and three legs of the tripod and all that stuff. Were you surprised when you became the chairman about things that were national security issues that you never kind of thought about? I mean, you talk about the pipeline, which I thought was kind of, an interesting departure, but there are other things, healthcare and things like that, that all are national security things that we just kind of pass over in our military lives.
Well, the short answer is yes. I mean, I was, as I tell people, I was not the same chairman on day one that I was, 4 years later. I felt that it was my obligation to continue to learn and to try to remember now, I was the chairman, which meant that I was the senior military officer in the armed forces. I was also following the president of the United States as his personal military advisor. And
Right.
so, I had these dual responsibilities, as well as the responsibility to consult with Congress, which, is always a bit of a challenge. So, but I mean, it's part of the job. And so you got to learn how to do it. But to your point, it's probably illustrative to tell you how presidents make decisions. And I see you're wearing glasses. And so, when you go to the eye doctor, they put that kidney-shaped plastic thing on your face, and then the eye doctor says, he flips the lenses, or she flips the lenses and says, is number one clearer or number two? Is this clearer or is that clearer? And if you're like me, you finally get to the point and you say, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I mean, they look the same at this point, which is exactly what they're trying to do. But the point is, it's those filters in an eye test that are kind of a metaphor for how a president in the sit room makes a decision. So he gets in there and he's got someone who's accountable to him to give him foreign policy advice, someone who's accountable to give him national defense strategy advice, someone who's supposed to give him military advice, someone who's supposed to give him budgetary advice.
Right.
And at the end of all that, they go back to their office, and then somebody's going to give them political advice. What is this going to mean to your standing with with your caucus on the Hill, and what's it going to mean to the midterm elections? And all of that is completely normal and intended, in my judgment, to create friction. Our system is intended to create friction. It's supposed to create creative friction. It's supposed to produce creative friction. So the friction between me and the intel community and the foreign policy community and the budgetary community is absolutely normal and expected and should be there. Mm-hmm. At some point, the president's got to make a decision, and part of the decision is how to keep that work creative. Right. And so it was really an adventure, but it was also, I mean, honestly, I left the job feeling pretty good about the system.
Right.
The balance of powers and all that, and how that all fits together. And I found that most people I worked around, even the ones that were really tough on me, I mean, look, Senator McCain was about as tough on me as I think he was ever on anyone. But at the end of the day, we were able to, find common ground on what we thought was best for the country. And I had great respect for him.
Well, in your book, you devote a good bit of time to your work with NATO. And of course, we both, as youngsters, spent a whole lot of time in Europe. And so I have NATO, I have very close to my heart. Probably the best, that we've ever been in relationship with Europe. Kind of, I think, in my opinion, stopped war since 45. And so we see a lot of pressure on NATO these days, and some of it is generated from our country, unfortunately. But what do you see as the future of NATO? I mean, we kind of have reached a wall now where we don't want to go get a whole lot more further east, because then we end up antagonizing the Russians. But at some point they want to join.
Who are the Russians?
No. I'm talking about Lithuania, the Baltics, and those guys. Well, Ukraine wants to join also. That would be a non-starter.
Well, it would be a non-starter in terms of the political impact and the I guess the threat that Russia could perceive from. I mean, look, since the wall fell in '89, NATO has expanded its reach 1,000 kilometers to the east, and so it's not all that surprising that Russia would feel squeezed a bit by that. I'm not a Russian apologist. I think that those countries that we've brought into NATO certainly had the right to choose their security futures themselves. Yeah. Look, to answer your question though about NATO is really to touch on the issue of alliances and globalism and multinationalism. Mm-hmm. And you said it best. I mean, you grew up in an environment, in an era, and in an alliance, as I did, that was intended. It was intended to do two things, really. One is it was intended to put like-minded nations in a consortium to oppose a group of nations who weren't like-minded with us, right. and by the way, to keep those nations, meaning the NATO alliance, aligned with each other. I mean, at some level, NATO began to keep Europe from fighting itself for the third time in 100 years, as well as to offset the influences of the Soviet Union. So the question, I think, for me now, as NATO kind of loses a bit of influence, is are those fundamental needs still the same, or have they changed? And I don't disagree with pressuring NATO to make greater contributions to the collective defense. I do think NATO, it's been part of the fabric of our national security architecture since the early 50s. And I think that fundamentally, we gain as much from them as they gain from us in terms of access and interoperability and all those things that make for an effective military organization. So look, and here's another way of thinking about it. I believe personally, there are some things that nations can solve themselves, and we could make a list of those. And then there's other things that no nation on the planet can solve by itself, either because they don't have the expertise, they don't have the reach, they don't have the resources. And among those, I would put security, national security. I think national security is best assured through systems of allies and partners. Okay, then, and other things, climate, climate, whether you believe it or not believe it, or whether you think it's imminent or long-term, no nation can solve, if there's a climate problem, no nation's going to solve it by itself. Pandemics cannot be solved by any one nation. They don't stop at borders. Migration, and migration occurs for any number of reasons, as you know. We've watched Europe struggle with migration for decades, unsuccessfully for the most part. And so I think migration fits into that category. And there's probably a handful of other things.
Right.
Those are best solved with multinational organizations. Now, here's the last thing I'll say about multinational organizations and allies. Winston Churchill had it completely right. He said the only thing worse than having allies is not having allies. Because when you have them and you're in them, you are going to have to give up some of the things you think you should have a single autonomous voice on. You might have to give up a bit of sovereignty on occasion. Right. Not a decision for a military person to make. Congress of the United States decides that. But the point is, I think we're far better served when we live within a system of allies and partners.
Absolutely. Let's transition. I've got some good questions coming from the audience, but a couple things I want to touch on before that we get in there. Seems like we've got a rising peer competitor who we will never, I'll say, outmass in China. But we're going to have to rely, on my opinion, and we did a program recently on changing our ways of acquiring equipment in the military. And of course, you're very familiar with the PPBS system. But do you think technologies such as robotics, artificial intelligence, and cyber ops are about to bring about another revolution in military affairs? I think we're kind of on the verge of that. But in a larger sense, if we're going to compete with the Chinese, we can't do it with our beautiful battleships and our beautiful F-35s, and that we got to have a lot of them. And we just can't afford it. So the answer is probably robotics, artificial intelligence, in my opinion. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, first of all, I'm not going to let you put me at odds with my Navy and Air Force brothers and sisters.
Yeah. I work for Lockheed. I love F-35s.
I know. No, we've been working on this for a while. I mean, first of all, to answer your question, it's inevitable that things like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, 3D printing, all of those things are going to dramatically affect every aspect of life, up to and including warfare. Right. And one of the things that I argued at, I'm not sure what year we would go back and say this was kind of the turning point. For me, I think 2014 was a seminal year in the sense that, we went from, if you think about the Warsaw Pact era, then we had the decade of the 90s where we weren't sure exactly what the future threats would look like. And then we encountered terrorism, and we were locked into that for a decade. In 14, Kim Jong-un asserted himself. Xi began to assert Chinese sovereignty into the South China Sea. Russia invaded the Crimea and eastern Ukraine. ISIS rose in 14. We had a pandemic in 14 with Ebola. And all of a sudden, for the first time in probably 30 years-ish, the United States had to deal with more than one thing at a time. And in the middle of all that came this technological surge, let's call it, whether it was the iPhone, roughly 2012, the iPhone 5 gave everybody everywhere the chance to know everything, either whether they were stationary or on the move, which changed a lot of things, including domestic politics, by the way. Yeah. So these years of 12 and 14, I think history will reflect, were the kind of inflection point you're suggesting.
Right.
The one thing I would add to the mix here is that, first of all, I agree it's going to change the nature of warfare. Secondly, we better think through the ethics of all this before we just rush into it in terms of capabilities. And I know that some might say, well, why should we worry about that if no one else in the world is worried about that? And my answer to that would be because we should. Mm-hmm. And so we've got to take all this incredible emerging, whether it's hypersonics or as I said, AI, quantum computing, and we got to make sure we apply an ethical filter to it, and then try to lead the world in the understanding that the nature of warfare is changing, and we better rethink some of the norms.
Yeah, that's a great point, because you have autonomous weapons out there with AI assisted, and you really you really don't know exactly who they might target if you've got,
Yeah.
So we got to weave that in. So it does obviously have some ethical dilemmas. Looking back at our involvement in the Middle East since 9/11, is there anything we could have done differently to achieve better outcomes? I mean, that's a kind of a hardball question, because you were part of the solution.
Yeah, or part of the problem, I guess. Depending on, how
it depends on which side.
Yeah. Let's take, first of all, the Mideast is a big place, and it doesn't exist except as, I forget the number, 14 individual countries. When I was CENTCOM, we had 27 countries that stretched from Afghanistan to Ethiopia. Then AFRICOM took 6 of them. So let's just say in the CENTCOM AOR, there's 21 countries. By the way, I'm sure you realize this, and most of your listeners, but in the greater Middle East, there's only 3 countries that have kind of always been countries. They all happen to also have been empires at one time. And that, of course, is Iran with the Persian Empire, Turkey with the Ottoman Empire, and then Egypt with the Egyptian Empire. Everything else in that region are relatively new to the international arena. And I think that's part of what we may have missed early on. So you say, is there anything we could have done differently? And one of the things in terms of grand strategy would seem to me to have been to find some way to acknowledge the difference in those 3 big countries, Iran, Turkey, and Egypt, and get them into the solutions. Secondly, we clearly didn't understand enough, pardon me, about the kind of internal conflict within Islam related to the Sunni sect and the Shia sect, which is not a whole lot different than what we went through in the Reformation in Christianity, and that's still going on, actually, to some significant extent. The dynamics we see playing out in both sides of the Gulf are related to whether the Sunni and Shia sects of Islam will find a way to live together and to share their religion. They would argue that's a fabrication of American thinking. Having been in the region for I guess, on and off for 7 years. It's not a fabrication, it's real. And so that's another aspect of it that I think we probably would have been, we would have made it some different decisions possibly if we'd understood that better,
Yeah.
you know, as we, for example, as we went into Iraq in 2003. And then the last thing is that, you know, again, this is a part of the world that where the presence of an ally and a partner and an alliance would, I think, have taken the spotlight off of this a bit in terms of U.S. involvement and made it less about us against them and them against us than it turned out to be. But look, let me be honest. As I look back on my 4 years as chairman, and I tried to, you know, unemotionally think through the times when I think I gave the president and the National Security Council and the Congress and the Secretary of Defense really good advice, and where I found my advice lacking, and not from want of trying, and not from, maybe somewhat from a lack of information or bandwidth, but the Syrian conflict was the impenetrable problem during my time as chairman, and may not have been impenetrable for others. It was impenetrable for me, because I just never felt like that the council could conceive of a course of action that would achieve the desired result at an acceptable cost. And by the way, that's the way strategy has to be built. It has to be, you know, acceptable, feasible, and sustainable. And we couldn't find a way to make it sustainable.
Yeah, it's still probably one of the most horrible things going on, and
it
doesn't seem to be a solution. And well, I've got some good questions here, and from our good friend Dion Termini. You do devote, and I think a kind of a humorous incident about getting in your Humvee, getting ready to go out on the other side of the wire and checking everybody to make sure they're all in the moment and all that. And then you got your machine gunner who you can't see, you know, up there on the 50. And, you doing all right up there, soldier? And it's a woman.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm doing good. Do you know how to work that thing? You bet your ass I do. And you said, well, yeah, that's exactly what we're doing. We're betting our ass. What do you think of the role of women in the Army? It used to be a big deal. I don't think it's a big deal anymore. I think soldiers are soldiers. They all wear great.
Yeah, John. It's only a big deal if we haven't done this. It will only be a big deal if we lower standards in order to diversify the force. But look, let me give you, you know, the obvious reason that we, you know, should provide, in my judgment, more opportunities for women in the military is that we really want to reflect the society we serve. And I know that there's some will say, well, you're going to do that, and you're going to, you know, you're at the cost of military readiness. I haven't seen that to be the case. Maybe, you know, maybe there's an isolated case out there, or 2 or 3 or 10, but generally speaking, my son just gave up command of a tank battalion and had, you know, of his 12 platoon leaders, 3 of them were women platoon leaders. And according to him, and you know, he would tell me, he's not going to tell me what I want to hear. He said 2 out of the 3 were among the top 5 in the battalion, which I've found to be kind of encouraging. And the second thing is, look, we're an all volunteer force, and you know that. And you probably served at the beginning of your career in a force that was, you know, the residual effects of a conscript force or a draft army.
Right.
And they were good people, but we're better. I mean, meaning the all volunteer force is just better. And yeah, you know, you probably know this, but only 1 out of 4 young men between 18 and 22 can qualify to get into the armed forces of the United States. 1 out of 4. The other 3 generally are disqualified for medical reasons, sometimes education, sometimes, you know, misconduct issues or things in their record that would disqualify them. Obesity is a crisis for recruiting, as it is a crisis in the country. Of the 1 out of 4 that can't get in, oftentimes it's obesity and the inability to, you know, we actually bring people into basic training and give them a target to get within standard in terms of weight. Some of them make it and most of them do not. And so I mean, where am I heading with this? Well, if you want to keep manning the all-volunteer force as the demographics of the country change and more women are born into families slightly, but then men, and then you have this reality of qualifications. Here's the reality: we need them. We need the best and brightest women as we need the best and brightest men if we're going to sustain the all-volunteer force out beyond 2025. So I was very proud to sign the document with Secretary Panetta that rescinded the combat exclusion for women, which then opened the door for the women to serve in combat, which in turn, well, they were already, by the way, but opened the door officially. And then in turn opened up some of the most, I think, and maybe today all of the MOSs are open to women. I think it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. My experience with women in the Army, starting from the late 70s, has been by and large very good. And I expected a lot, and I got a lot. And so I had a anyway. One of the questions. Let's go back to West Point. This person doesn't choose to identify themselves, but it's a good question. What is the most important lesson you learned from West Point, and what's the most important lesson you learned from the West Wing? Oh, okay. Two Wests.
Well, okay. No, that is a good question. So West Point, I think it was that, they allow you to learn about the tension between dedication to a team and dedication to a set of institutional values: duty, honor, country. So I mentioned in the book, West Point kind of sneaks up on you in that regard. Your first experiences at West Point are all about, you're part of a team. I don't care necessarily that you succeed, what I really want you to do is I want you to succeed in the context of the team. That's not necessarily on the academic side I'm talking about. But in terms of squads and companies and battalions and formations, everyone is interested in your personal success, but only in the context of the team's mission, right? And then they sneak up on you with this thing called the honor code, and they say, well, look, you have to be dedicated to the team, but if some member of your team violates the institutional norms, in this case, the honor code, you are obligated to turn them in. You are obligated to make sure that they are no longer a member of the team. And you think to yourself, wow, these two ideas are held in conflict with each other. My loyalty to the team and my loyalty to the value of integrity and honor. What a valuable lesson. And I say they're in conflict. Clearly, they hope, meaning the academy, and we come to the conclusion that loyalty has limits. That's part of the reason I picked that chapter for the book. It's a two-way street. It has to be earned and re-earned, and it has limits. That was, to me, the most valuable lesson, I think, that I took out of West Point, among many, by the way. West Wing, I think it was, this is just me personally, it was relationships. You can get, there's a saying in Washington that you can get almost anything done as long as you don't care who gets the credit. Absolutely true. The corollary of that is you can get anything done, almost anything done in Washington, if you have a good relationship and are trusted and you're trusted and you have a group you trust and they trust you. And if you don't establish that level of trust, you're not going to get anything done. There's just too many ways that things in the White House can be parked or delayed or just never even considered. But if you have standing in terms of the relationships you've built as part of that team, you can get a lot done.
Yeah, that is a wonderful lesson. The whole idea of loyalty, and it's a two-way street. One of the things that, we're always being followers or advisors, and you bring that up a lot, and I've got another couple questions, but one of the questions is talking about working upward versus working downward. I was concentrated up as a battalion commander and company commander on team building, and I did that 95% of my life, and spent about 5% upwards.
Yeah.
As you get older and transition, you really have to work upwards because you really need to know what's going on in your boss's head. Sometimes
Right.
hard to figure out.
Mhm.
You know, what are your thoughts about, especially the chairman to president of the United States? That's got to be a tough relationship in some
Yeah.
regards.
Well, I mean, think about it this way. That's, by the way, that's why we had this course designed to help, you know, men and women who made general understand the difference in
Yeah.
their responsibilities at that point. Um, think about it this way. What does the team need from you? So when you're a young officer or a young executive, you know, you have more maturity, hopefully you have more experience, and they need that. They don't have it, you know, and so
Right.
you have to, so focusing downward on them for the majority of your time is really important because you're, first of all, it's a smaller team, so you can influence them more readily, and you have something they don't have. Okay. As you matriculate into higher levels of responsibility, and you ask yourself, okay, what does the team need from me now? Well, they don't need, you know, my experience, my maturity to help mold them and to get their jobs right. What they really need is for me to be working lateral relationships and then eventually leading up in order to get the resources they need, whether that resource is time or guidance or money. And that's what it was like, you know, when I went to work in the Pentagon, as the chairman, my instinct was to get the heck out of Washington, D.C., you know, get on my airplane, go visit Iraq. I did all these things, but my instinct was to stay gone, you know, go to Iraq, go to Afghanistan, go
Any
to
day out of the
Central,
Pentagon's a good day.
go to, yeah, right. And, but that's not what my job was, you know, and it felt good for me to walk with the troops in Iraq and Afghanistan as chairman and speak to them, you know, ex cathedra. And, but that wasn't really my job. So I really, I had to come to the conclusion, I got to stay in Washington for the most part. And I got to get in the mosh pit and elbow my way around and build relationships and make sure that we get the right size budget, that we get the kind of guidance we need, that I educate my peers, if you will, on what the military can do, but importantly also what it can't do.
Uh-huh.
And so that's leading laterally and up. And as I said, I got better at it over time. There were times, you know, I made some mistakes. Here's what I tell people, and I could use this in this audience. You know, how many of you are married? I can't see anybody now, but how many of you are married? And you get most people put their hands up, and then you say, well, how many of you, you know, just kind of sprung the question because it was 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, or how many of you, more likely, actually choreographed the time when you were going to ask your spouse to marry you? And of course, everybody chuckles and agrees. Oh yeah, you know, you can't just stumble into this thing. You got to plan it. Well, that's the same thing about giving advice to the President of the United States. I can remember early in my tenure having a request for more forces in Afghanistan passed to me by the commander. And I went dutifully. The next time I had a chance, I went across the river and I went and saw the president. And he said no. And I said, wow, that didn't go the way I thought it would go. So I talked to the chief of staff, who was really a great help to me, a guy named Dennis McDonough. And I said, okay, that didn't work out the way I wanted. What could I have done differently? He said, look, just, you got to pick your time. You know, if you're going to come to the president with something as significant, you know, like a budget failure or a force structure or inequality or, you know, something really, you know, impactful, you got to pick, we got to work on the timing of that, because you could walk in there and he might be up to his ears in Obamacare or, you know, some issue across the country, or, you know, I mean, we might be getting ready to go to the UN to give a speech to the General Assembly. I mean, there's a million examples. And so I got really good, to be honest with you,
Right.
at not only knowing what to take to the president, but when and how to take it. You know, how did he listen? How did he learn? You know, how could I tell if he was engaged, when he was engaged and when he wasn't? And you got to do, and that's, you know, that's the job of the advisor, not the job of the principal, to know those things.
But yeah, exactly, doing the right job for the services is critical, and you need to know what's going on in the boss's head and when. That's back to West Point. I've got a couple of questions. It's kind of a two-part question. Is West Point changing to meet the changes in the military and for future leaders? And what would you say to a high school student who was interested in one of the service academies these days?
Yeah, I mean, that's probably a graduate of my era that's asking that question, who has come to the conclusion that West Point is not meeting the needs. You know what I mean?
His initials are RG.
Yeah. I joke with my son, who, every once in a while he'll blurt out, "Oh, that place has gone to hell since I left." Look, I know a lot about the academy. I'm still engaged with all of the academies, not just. In fact, I'm giving a speech to the Coast Guard Academy in a couple of weeks. I think the academies are doing a terrific job,
right,
of two things. One is changing to meet the kind of emerging challenges that come with technology and a changing world, while at the same time not changing the secret sauce.
Right.
McDonald's may change its menu from time to time, but that secret sauce ain't changing, because that secret sauce is what gets people in there to chomp down on the 1,000-calorie Big Mac. So I think the Academy's done a great job. And I'll tell you, we are blessed that young men and women across the country still want to go there. We still get a very high quality candidate. The organizations around the country help us find them. And by the way, we're increasing, back to women. The West Point has been sitting down, let's say 15, 16, 17% of every entry class were women. Now it's up to 25, which puts us about the same as the other academies. I don't know whether 25 is the right number, but it's a good number.
Yeah.
And so I think we are doing a great job of making sure that the young men and women who go there are challenged to understand a changing environment, but at the same time, never forgetting that this formula has produced, the country's been protected by West Pointers and ROTC cadets and OCS grads and officers and enlisted in a very successful way for a very long time, and we don't want to lose that.
Here's kind of a big one, and I hope it doesn't sound too political, because it's become we've spent last 3 years, we spent a whole lot of money in DoD trying to, I'll say, recover something that may or may not have been lost. I think the years of deployments have ground down not just the equipment but the people. And I don't know how all families went through this for so many years. And I've got good friends, sons who have done 5, 6, 7, some 10 deployments. It's ridiculous. Yeah. I mean, but how about the preparedness of the military now? And do we have to sort of go through a post-Vietnam sort of rebuild? Is that, I don't know. But General Abrams, he brought that along back in the early 70s.
Oh, yeah.
He did a good job of it in Depew.
Yeah.
Those guys, yeah.
Look, I think that there are some aspects of our military and its ability to operate that need to be refreshed. I'm not sure rebuilt. And by the way, there's no greater way to find out if a military is effective than to put it into combat. So we've got young men and women. The deployments are onerous, and I'll come back to that in a second. But the experiences that these young men and women have had really early on in their careers and continue to have are invaluable. I mean, nobody wants to go to war, but it produces an experience unlike any other. So we got that to build on, which is why, if I sound confident, it's because the one thing you never want to be unclear about is whether a group of young men and women will fight. These young men and women will fight. I mean, they are fighters in every service. Now let's talk about what are the things that we may not be as skilled at as we were in the past. Long range logistics, to be honest. The last 20 years, we've had civilian contractors that we've employed to build base camps, and then the military just falls in on them. Right. When I took the 1st Armored Division to Baghdad, we fell in on or occupied base camps that were already established. Really, all I had to do was change the phone numbers on the really. I mean,
Yeah.
and then I was up and going. I was up in action. The food was all, catered for the most part and contracted, as was the long range communications. And so I think one of the things that all the military services are looking at is kind of our expeditionary capability. Can we be an expeditionary army? Could we go back to Europe and reinforce it with our logistics? If we got the force there, it'll do fine. But can we get it there? And when we get it there, can we protect it, feed it, provide medical care and all the things we have to do in an expeditionary fashion on the move? I think we've got work. It's not just me. We've got work to do in that regard. And so that's that. And then, the last thing is, just adapting to the fact that there are going to be fewer probably, you talked about robotics earlier on. I mean, that's coming. And my guess is the military is probably a little small in my judgment. I could give you the numbers for the Army, how small I think we are. I think we need 540,000 active. We got about 485. Yeah. And this gets to the op-tempo issue. You and I grew up in an Army where we were stationed in Germany, which meant you had your family with you. So you'd go on an exercise to shoot gunnery at Grafenwehr or go on a maneuver, but you were home. Now we're we're doing less deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. And we're doing more deployments to Korea and to Europe. And when you net it all out, the deployments haven't slowed down a bit. And I think they have to. I just don't think we can keep young men and women separated from their families at the rate we are now, whether we send them into combat or into a peacetime deployment to Poland.
Well, I think we're coming to the end of our time together, and I could go on for hours. You've been just so, and I appreciate your candor, really, sir. It's just, I'm
retired. I got nothing to lose.
Well, I haven't asked you to sing Danny Boy yet, so that may be coming as a closing. but in any case, it's time to say goodbye, and I thank you very much for your candor, and congratulations, 1st Armored Division soldiers. I mean, that's quite an outfit, and you commanded it when it was as big as it's ever been. So, good work. Thank you for your
Thank you. It was an honor.
Yeah, good. And so on that, we'll say goodbye and appreciate you coming very much.
All right, thanks, John.
All right. Hope to see you again, sir.
Same here.